All right. I know a lot of you seem to like my scuffy Alistair video. So to commemorate it getting 100 views, we're going to start a new channel for theories, and to advertise it, I'm going to see if I can do a cross thing. But I got inspired to do this video after seeing and catching up on my Elden Ring lore videos. So essentially, there's this enemy called a Oracle Envoy, and in the game, they say that no one knows where they actually come from, and that it's a mystery. They're like this otherworldly entity that just showed up one day to beckon in to beckon forth a new age or god by playing their trumpet. Now, I have a bit of a theory, an interesting one. So, my theory is that the emissary envoys were actually created secretly by the Golden Order. Now, see, there's this old tradition from the era of the Crucible and some other period within Elden Ring's history around the time America became a god. Sometime before that, essentially, they would take corpses, put them in jars, seal them, and as like some type of burial. But in the DLC, it's shown that the end goal was to make jar saints, most likely. Essentially, after a period of time, some confuckery using the magic of the crucible and the magic of America's bloodline. Essentially, uh, America was originally one of these hallowed entities, which was well known. Well, bloodlines. They were well known for their acceptability for grafting. For example, if someone lost an arm, taking an arm from one of these people and grafting it onto yourself will have a 100% success rate to be a successful graft. That's why Godric the Grafted is so uh is the best example of this, because he's literally Hulk if he was a psychopathic serial killer. Instead of turning green and big, he stole and grafted body parts to himself. Yeah. So essentially, the key ingredient was one of these easily graftable bloodlines to make this new entity, which is it has many different variations within the DLC. But The other thing is, why aren't any of these jar entered entities in the base game? But you see, I think the envoys are a dressed up version of one of these jar saints, and or uh usurped created through a similar ritual or something like that. But essentially, the emissaries or envoys were made using these jars. And essentially, from the DLC, after a jar grows limbs, it's supposed to find somewhere to hatch. Essentially, my guess is the magical adaptation is the jar, once it gains uh, enough ripeness, it grows arms and legs and is tasked to seek out the perfect conditions to finish its fermentation process. But the problem in the base game is twofold. So basically, you can find these living jars in multiple places, including Stormvale Castle, with where Godric the Grafted is, and a few other places like Renulucaria, the place with the mages. They're most likely studying those, trying to figure out how in the fuck they're ambulatory despite, you know, being a jar full of rotting biomass, for lack of better words. But essentially, there's also these gardens, per se, filled with these jars. My guess is when they start moving around, they would normally be taken to one of these processing facilities, like where Godric the Grafted worked, and be further refined and dressed up to be one of those envoy creatures, the ones with the trumpets. Because, if left alone to their own devices, they become, well, the other thing, which is an old carryover from the age of the Crucible, which, the Golden Order is trying to move away from that. But essentially, what I'm getting at is the Golden Order not only has the history of outright destroying things that go against whatever the fuck they choose is against them, but more specifically, recycling. They have shown time and time again, by accepting and redefining something to make it work for the Golden Order instead of eradicating it outright. So essentially, what I'm putting forward here is, instead of letting the jar saints or the innards become the things we come across in the DLC. They originally collected them when the jars started to move around, and then they would make them into the envoys instead of the bad things, and then use them as decorations. I mean, to everyone else, they would be decorations, but they specifically call forth new dawn. A new age or God being born. But you see, an oracle or seer, that's the brand name of what they are. That's what they tell the people. Now, a lot of religious fantasy MacGuffins, especially around gods, have topic uh, energies. Though you don't know what topism is, it's essentially the idea that something exists because people think it exists. And the fact that once enough people believe it existing gets to a point where it does exist, causing more people to believe that it does exist. Essentially, a malicious, a virulent cycle of belief that uh, either hits a point where it becomes real or it pops. That like the Greek gods, the Egyptian gods, they enough people believed in them to be real, but they fell apart. But this is a video game, and we're talking about a magical world here. Essentially, enough faith energy would pull these things into what they are being sold as to the stupid public people. But everyone else knows that they're an alarm system. Because they sound the arrival of a new age or a god to a holy order like the Golden Order, which is a giant kingdom filled with demigods that could blow up at the drop of a hat or pin or whatever the fuck. You would probably want an early warning system to warn the higher ups that some really bad shit might go down. you know, Essentially, what I'm getting at is the envoys are the smoke alarm, the fire being a world redefining event, such as the birth of a god, or the collapse and rebuilding of an age or era. So, and that's where the interesting problem comes in. Is the smoke alarm sounding because the battery is dying, or is it really a fire? So, Essentially, practically, they're the smoke alarm. Now, here's where I get to the interesting part, bigger bit of my theory here. During the wars of the shattering, they stopped making envoys because they no longer needed them. The fire's already here. Might as well, that and, this entire thing would require logistics, not just for the Holy Kingdom, but it also depends on the factors of these holy sites, their remoteness, and the fact that one of the people who were in on this, or peoples were in on this, are now on the other side of the valley holding their own banner. Essentially, the other thing that I want to get into is most likely this process to make them would include some type of embalming because the arms are blue, and sealing them in white cloth to make them look angelic and not gross, rotted, recongealed meat people. So, yeah, essentially, I don't know the process, but there should be a process. You know, so where have the other jar entered entities gone? That's where the next part of my theory comes in, and that is the living jars, but more specifically, the jar folk. There is a hidden town of sentient living jars. And from this point on, I am going to call them the jar folk because they're no longer living jars. They've gained sentience. And why they gain sentience has probably something to do with the first potentate, which is the holy caregiver of the jar folk, the person that tends to them, teaches them, essentially a parent. So this means that there was a first, if it's a tradition, obviously. The first potentate, caregiver of these jars, at first probably did it out of the kindness of his heart, and eventually they started to talk back. Obviously. But, this care, this kindness sparked their self awareness and thus stunting their original purpose, which was to find a nice place to finish the fermentation process and then get, lack of better word, chest burst into oblivion because they were the egg, per se. Now, this sentience, sentience, many, uh, many philosophers have sort of view it as a parasite compared to the order of nature. You know, the key things to an animal is the triangle of food, water, reproduction. Anything that negates those is an abnormality. So essentially, you're fed and watered, you make more. But for example, self awareness has its advantages, but self awareness has to be taught by a self aware individual to a semi aware or potential aware being. You know, for example, feral kids. If no one teaches a kid anything, they go feral. They revert to the animal because they weren't taught to be self aware, conditioned. Essentially, what I'm getting at is the jars would emptily follow the instinct that told them to find a nice place to finish fermenting and hatch. So instead of that, hatching, they were taught to be self aware. And then they taught other living jars how to be self aware. And then that negated their primary instinct. And now that's why there is a huge village of jar folk. And it also explains why these isolated groups of living jars scattered across the lands between are still feral. They attack you, most likely because they were abducted by people. Some of them want to just be left alone. But they're still there because the world fell apart around them and they've been there because they were underneath the impression they couldn't leave. Or they probably couldn't. So, at any rate, the living jars you come across that don't talk are the original feral variety of living jars. And the jar folk explain why there hasn't been any jar saints loose outside of the DLC area. It's because it takes a long ass time for them to grow legs, one, Two, why they grow legs is to find a nice place to hatch. Three, during phase two of their life cycle, they were intercepted by the Golden Order to then secretly convert into the envoys. Once the shattering happened, they didn't have the time or infrastructure or need to make more envoys because there is no point in making the smoke alarm when the house is already caught fire, is still on fire in some places, and most likely cannot burn anymore. There's no point in putting a smoke alarm in a burning house. You don't need to make them if the house is on fire. They serve their purpose for the time they were needed. They're no longer needed or can no longer be made. So essentially what I'm getting at to end this off is probably an interesting insight I found a while ago. It's a video by, I think, The Rotting Truth or Rotten History. I'll put a link down below in the description for you guys. But more specifically, a video about the first Habsburg and how he went mad. He essentially was fascinated with the old timey idea of uh, how life was, they started perceiving ways of how life flourishes. Essentially, they came to the conclusion that death is not a true end of life because things are born from death. Maggots and rot, bacteria, all that bullshit. But he became fascinated with the aftermath of death to the point where he started to fill jars with his own bodily waste, excrement. He stopped bathing. Essentially, he became a living, rotting corpse. And he had a library of jars that he filled and fed pieces of himself to. He also gave them names and treated them like his children. So, this is a possible inspiration for the magic living jars. They are jars that have been filled with dead people, left to ferment, rot. And in the hope that they would gain new life from death. Essentially, semi reincarnating their contents. Now, the other thing I feel I need to bring up as part of this whole theory is the ingredients. you would put into the jar. For example, if you put Golden Order devoted soldiers that died in war in these jars, you would more likely get a Golden Order variant of the jar innards or jar saints, whatever the fuck you want to call them, which would help make envoys and be converted. These things had to have been made. The whole part of them being from a different realm is just publicity. For essentially a glorified smoke detector. But that's the interesting thing here. This is one of those things you need to speculate about because the game literally tells you no one knows where they come from. But, there has to be a reason why these set pieces are here. It could just be that the developers put these set pieces here to tell a story of them trying to figure out why these jars are walking around. But considering the landmarks, only one of them would be trying to figure out why in the fuck these jars are walking around, and that's the college. The fact that Stormvale Castle and one of the demigods are in the same place as a group of living jars, but more specifically, a fenced off area that appears to be some type of holding cell for living jars. Has to be a clue. There has to be a reason for them to have these jars to begin with. And that they've been around probably since the shattering, just sitting there. Especially considering that there's a town of Jar folk that have an entire religion and tradition around a holy, blessed caregiver. So that's kind of my thoughts at the moment. There's definitely a notable outlier here, and that's Alexander the Jar Warrior. But that it also helps point towards self awareness, and not just self awareness, but a want to do something more than be a vessel waiting to break. Now, I'll also put in the description uh, an interesting YouTube channel I found a while ago, but he's pretty famous. Probably heard of him. He does deep dives in the lore. And I kind of feel like this is a pretty solid theory. I haven't played the game too much at all. Matter of fact, I think I have a save file I've been wanting to get back to, uh, but just didn't have the time to sit down and play Elden Ring. I'll make myself some time. I did try record it in the past, but there's so many people playing Elden Ring and uploading it that it's really hard for the algorithm to suggest my video, since there is creators that are more famous who uploaded the video. But that's the interesting thing with YouTube. If there's an interest for it, there is a market. And sometimes if that market is sparse, it's easier to for the algorithm to show people the wares. Essentially, you have to roll those dice and hope you get a good roll. But essentially, uh, I also have a video gaming channel. I don't normally do Elden Ring yet. If there's an interest in it, I might do it. Try to do a semi-blind playthrough of Elden Ring. Well, continue my old save. I think I'm in an area with fingers. I haven't played in a long time. You know, the finger critters. But that's the interesting thing with Elden Ring. The writers and creators of this game have put so many details in certain mysterious storylines. You know, the whole part of there not being any info about any of this, you know, no paper trail, adds to the fact that it had to have been some sort of secret cabal to make the envoys from the living jars, or using some variation of the jar burial ritual to make them. Now, an interesting thing I'll bring up is not only are these creatures blue, but they don't bleed. The envoys. And the fact that they're vaguely humanoid and obviously bulbous with the cloth, which is because there's layers upon layers of cloth on these things. And they're definitely made of meat, but they don't bleed. And one of my other guesses with part of this conversion thing is they're probably putting some preservatives in them to prevent them from rotting and stinking, as well as probably some incense and perfumes somewhere in the cloth bags. But the only thing they need these things to do on top of that is see the future and blow a horn and move around and do some minor things like find a nice perch to sit on. As you know, they're essentially not just smoke alarms, they're living decorations to help sell the mysterious otherworldly entity thing. That and they're sort of pseudo mascots of the area they're in. You know, they're part of the decor. And the fact that they are seers in a way implies that they know things. You know, they can see the future. Obviously, you, the player, they target and attack. Probably because, you know, they're also part of a security system. That, or they foresee you attacking them and killing them. But, you know, if they're a seer, they should be able to tell that you, the player, is most likely not going to attack them unless you first attack the player. You know, I mean, the player attack them if they, you know, the player won't attack them if they themselves don't attack you, which kind of also laps into the fact that they're also a security system. But they're smoke alarms before defenders. And, you know, the interesting thing with faith and topism is they're kind of the same concept. You know, the more people who believe in a certain thing, the more power it has. That's what topism is. And the same things apply to faith, especially when we're talking about fantasy games and fantasy storytelling. The more people that believe in a certain entity, the more power that entity tends to have. For example, Zeus is the king of his pantheon because he is the most powerful one. And the more people who believe he is the more powerful one of his pantheon, the more powerful he is of his pantheon. But like I said, it's a sort of a double-edged sword. The more people that believe them as oracles, the more good at being an oracle they are. And my guess is the envoys, you know, if my theory is correct, that they are a manufactured product that requires a supply chain that only existed before the wars. You know, it also means that the envoys can't make more of themselves, so there's a finite amount of them. And the main reason why we don't see jar innards or saints or all of those variants of uh recongealed magic corpses is because the jar full. Sentience being a parasite and all that, self awareness gives the jars enough willpower to fight the continuation of the process of their fermentation. The main reason why all of the living jars are sort of in this hostile neutral position. You know, most likely because they were captured and mistreated by people in order to capture them and then use them for whatever reason. And the other thing I want to bring up is the perfumers hunting the jar folk seems to be a newer problem, because if these perfumers existed in the lands between during the shattering, you know, that's a conflict of interest for making smoke alarms. But again, that adds into the fact that the perfumers want the jar pieces to make break reusable breakable vessels, like the player can do. You know, you can you get the self-repairing baubles that you can fill with random shit and throw at people, and they break, and then they pop back in your inventory like they were never used. That's what the perfumers want to make with the jars. So my guess is they ran out of their dwindling supply, which was a byproduct of making the envoys. And it took them a long ass fucking time to find the jar folk village, because there's at least one palpitate's lifetime we have to consider here. You know, if these perfumers attacked the original pulpentate and killed all but one jar to allow that one jar to collect more living jars, turning them into jar folk to keep them all in one place where they keep getting more jars and performing their religion of finding a new pulpentate and all of that. Essentially, a self providing cycle of jar murder. But, that's probably what's going on here in the jar village. jar folk village. And it kind of makes a lot of sense because the jar gardens aren't, I know those are the unripe versions of these jar things. The living jars are like the secondary life uh, stage of these things. And the jar folk are essentially a stagnated stage 2 entity, the stage 3 being the weird uh, corpse entered entities, I know jar entered entities, or the envoy, which is essentially, in my theory, a crafted entity dressed up to look as angelic as possible. And I'm pretty sure that this theory has some grounds to it, especially when you consider the likely facts, influence being the king who went stark crazy mad, believing rot, to the point where he started naming his jars, treating them like children. Yeah, that was a really big scandal. It's one of those scandals where the entire court tried to put underneath the rug and cover up. Matter of fact, uh, once that uh, that king died, they burned all of his jar kids and tried to silence the entire thing, including the popes and priests that flocked to this king as like this next holy emissary. They missed one. Uh, he managed to hide away a diary filled with notes of this king and the king's beliefs towards the end of his life. At one point, I shit you not, to quote this scenario and the video I put down in the link, is, Sire, do you want me to scare the flies away? The king goes, No, I hear their whispers, for they are messengers. Yeah, yeah, like I said, he went stark raving mad. And it's an interesting possible influence. The more I think about this, the more I feel it's possible. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and end off now because it kind of feels like I'm running in a circle now. But I hope you guys like the video, like, subscribe, so on. Also, this is probably where I'm going to be putting the rest of my theory slash retrospective videos. Hope you guys enjoyed. Like, subscribe, comment down below if you think I'm looking too much into possibly a line of coincidences. See you later.